to, I believe it's the 6th day of public programming at DBF. Thank you so much for coming to this evening's talk. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Mr. Rakan Altouq, General Supervisor for Cultural Affairs and International Relations at the Saudi Ministry of Culture and Vice Chairman of the Board of DBF, Dr. AbdelRahman Azzam, our moderator, an author and scholar, Ms. Konul Rafiyeva, Head of International Relations at the Azerbaijan National Museum of Art, Dr. Bakhrum, Vice President of the Uzbekistan Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Shahed Saleem, lecturer, curator, and architect, and author of The British Mosque. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I will hand over to our panelists.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming to tonight's panel. This evening, for the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to be undertaking an incredible journey across the Muslim world. We're going to go from the libraries of Timbuktu all the way to the observatory of Ulugh Beg's observatory in Samarkand. We're going to be exploring ideas. But the main theme of tonight, as our speakers will point out, and I should also say, we're going to make a small detour to England, a country where the Muslim is a minority, the Muslims are a minority, to explore some of the main ideas and themes. What's behind this tonight's panel, what's behind the Al-Madar Gallery, which has been motivated by this panel, is that, it's not working? Yeah, okay. Is really the relationship between Islam, the relationship between the center and the edge. The relationship of how Islam spread. Now, we all know that Islam spread very fast. We all read in our books that Islam spread in the Far East and Africa through trade. But the question is, how did it spread so fast? And what happened when Islam reached the edges of Western Africa or Central Asia? How did Islam nurture? How did it endure? How did it grow? More importantly, how did local traditions and cultures enrich the religion and the universality of the religion itself? These are some of the themes we'll be exploring tonight. Another theme that we're going to be looking at is the relationship between the center and the edge. The normal narrative that we all grew up with is that Islam came from heartlands, of course, from Arabia, from Mecca and Medina, and from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, and spread out. But the question is, was this a one-way journey, or was it a dialogue? Did the Muslims from the edges actually enrich religion and send it back in a much more profound manner? These are all the themes. Tonight, I've asked our speakers to unfortunately, to limit their talks to 8 to 10 minutes, just to give us an opportunity to have a debate and questions. And I'm not going to spend too much time introducing them, except to say they're all absolutely brilliant in their fields. And I'd like to start, if I may, with Professor Zachary Wright, professor at Northwestern University in Qatar, who has written extensively on Islam in Senegal and Mali. Perhaps to ask him initially to talk about something we discussed earlier, is this kind of debate of Islam in Africa versus African Islam, and the overall positive but also controversial debate that's been happening about how Islam in Africa evolved over the centuries.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the conference organizers, to this beautiful exhibition. I'm really blown away. And also to Dr. AbdelRahman Azzam for organizing this really interesting panel. I'm so honored to be a part of it. So the first matter I'd like to disabuse us of is this idea that Islam spreads through trade, spreads through Arabs traveling around the world. Islam does not spread except by people becoming convinced of the religion itself, and then being the spokespersons to their own communities. And this is really the case for Islam in Africa. And so this polarity between Islam and Africa, or an African Islam, is actually quite misleading, right? So we're really talking about people coming to make tahqiq of their own religious identity, sort of actualize this religious identity, and then spread it to their own people in their own so-called vernacular languages, but often with Arabic as the kind of the foundational sacred language. And so one scholar has pointed out that Arabic really functions as the so-called Latin of Africa. And so, in terms of this dialogue back and forth, of course, there's this very interesting statement that comes out of a discussion between the Umayyad Caliph, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and one of the great scholars of the time, Ibn Shihab Zuhri. And the Caliph says, in fact, after he's been assured that all of the governors of the local provinces during the Umayyad Caliph are being led by non-Arabs. He says, indeed, Islam will remain with the Arabs, but it will be strengthened by the non-Arabs. And this is a statement that I haven't heard said much except in West African texts. And it's a sort of a claim of the ability that to have that West African Muslims, as well as Muslims around the periphery of the Muslim world elsewhere, have important things to say to the global discourse of intellectual exchange. They're not just the receivers of that discourse. And yes, that discourse or that conversation is taking place in Arabic, so you find in all of the ulum al-din, all of the religious sciences, whether it's Quranic explanation, tafsir, whether it's fiqh or usul al-fiqh, jurisprudence or methodologies of deriving jurisprudences, sciences of Sufism, you find that the West African Muslims, as well as non-Arabs elsewhere, are very much influenced by what's happening, the textual production coming out of Cairo, but they're also contributing to that discourse. So one of, if you can say, I'll just very, very briefly just mention kind of three or four areas in which you really see West African Muslims contributing to a vibrant global discourse. One is around the issue of Islam and politics, and how the ulama in particular, the scholarly class, should be independent of state power. And so what happens in West Africa, in contradistinction to elsewhere in the Muslim world, particularly in Cairo and elsewhere, is that Muslim scholarly independence is predicated upon agrarian independence. So they have their own farms. Now that's different than in Cairo and elsewhere in the Muslim world, where the scholarly class was primarily deriving financial independence from their control over the awqaf, the system of Islamic charitable endowments. What happens, the liability of this latter way of doing things, is that when the modernizing state steps in, it confiscates the awqaf, it breaks the ulama. The ulama class is essentially marginalized. In West Africa, this has not happened because even to this day, scholarly communities have their own financial dependence based upon having their own farms and their own land. And so one of the ways of thinking about Islam in West Africa is that traditionally financially independent scholarly class is still viable in West Africa, where in many places today, Muslim scholars are functionaries of the state. They have their salaries paid by the government. So very, very quickly, there are some other issues about fiqh opinions surrounding enslavement, for example, where West African scholars definitively try to question an emerging association between blackness and enslavement or enslavability. So Ahmed Baba, the famous scholar of Timbuktu, for example, he writes an opinion basically reminding his Arab counterparts that many, many so-called black people have been Muslim for generations, and perhaps longer than some people in Morocco have been Muslim. And he even says at one point, in our people, these people have accepted Islam voluntarily, unlike some other people, right? In other words, that their Islam is true. They didn't accept Islam under threat of military conquest. Issues about smoking are also an interesting area of exchange, of scholarly exchange, and West African Muslims, I think, have attained an ijma or scholarly consensus very much earlier than other parts of the Islamic world that smoking is haram. And this was a very lively and extensive debate, but I won't get into it now. But in fact, they were castigating some of their Arab counterparts for licensing or justifying smoking. Although the scholars of Timbuktu were famously in favor of smoking because they derived lots of money off of the tobacco trade coming into Morocco. But over time, that opinion was marginalized. Also, I would mention usul al-fiqh, the idea of deriving scholarly opinions. So the West African tradition has an interesting positionality in being able to respect the madhab. In other words, respect the sort of the established schools of Islamic law, the 4 Sunni schools of jurisprudence, mostly Maliki in West Africa, but not being being able to make ijtihad out of the madhab without abandoning the madhab. You can see that other places in the Muslim world, oftentimes they're caught between a polarity between abandoning all forms of traditional Islam and then being sort of dogmatically attached to them. And so one of the famous scholars will say, we're Maliki, but we're not the slaves of Imam Malik. نحن مالكيون ولسنا مماليك Imam Malik, right? And so you see the majority of West African Malikis then pray qabd, pray with their hands on their chest, which is not like other Malikis in other parts of the Muslim world. And there are some other significant ijtihads too. The last thing I would just mention, I know, am I out of? Okay, yeah, I'm getting is a capacity for thinking about Islamic spirituality and defining it particularly in what was often called from the 18th century forward, an idea of the Tariqa Muhammadiyah, so that the idea that the ultimate practice of Islamic spirituality was that connected to the example and enduring spiritual presence of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. So, and this is, when we invoke this word of Sufism, I think this is important because the scholars of Timbuktu and all of these scholars, yes, if we look back at their scholarly biographies, we probably say, yeah, they seem to be some kind of Sufis, but they were representative of the scholarly establishment from 15th century Timbuktu all the way to the present in Muslim West Africa. And that essentially means that they did not see themselves as somehow, their practice of Islamic spirituality did not somehow differentiate themselves from the larger Muslim community. So I think these are lessons from the West African context that I think are enduringly relevant to the rest of the Muslim world. Thank you very much.
And just a very quick question before we move on. How far did these sheikhs lead any anti-colonialist, nationalist movements? Were they at the vanguard of these?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really fascinating question. So one scholar that I did a lot of research on, but he's not the only one. This is Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, who is known as the Sheikh al-Islam of West Africa. He died in 1975 from Senegal, and he was the vice president of the World Muslim League based in Mecca during his lifetime. And he was very much interested in pushing forward pan-Islamic, pan-African at the same time, anti-colonial discourses. And so he actually actively campaigned to have broader regional solidarities, not only within West Africa, but shared between the Arab world and the African world. And at one time he reminded Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was his friend, that, you're talking about pan-Arabism, but I will remind you that the Arab world extends from Indonesia to Ghana. Anywhere people speak Arabic, that's the Arab world. Yeah.
Thank you, Zach. Now, if we were to move a few thousand miles eastward, I'd like to now move on to Azerbaijan and to Konul, Rafiyeva. Azerbaijan, of course, Islam came early to Azerbaijan, but you've had a particular historical examples, as is with Uzbekistan, which we'll touch on later, which is, of course, 70 years of communist rule. And having emerged from this, I'd love to know if you could speak about how Azerbaijan currently, through your experience as an art curator at the National Museum of Azerbaijan, how you're trying to combine preserving the older traditions, which are the Islamic culture traditions, how you are responding to the kind of post-communist restoration of tradition, and of course, at the same time, adopting a push towards modernity.
Thank you for the question. It is really interesting. And actually, Islam, Azerbaijan, we joined Islam civilization at, it started at 8th century until 15th century. It finished it actually. And just, though it was Arabian language, later it replaced it more or less by Persian. And then beginning of, end of 18th century, so Russia, Imperial, Tsar and Iran, they divided Azerbaijan territory, so it became part of Iran and Russian Empire. So we were, our part, North Azerbaijan, that we can't territory, we stayed under Russia, and the Russian language integrated to Azerbaijan culture, but it was considered all Islam cultures, values. People prayed, they studied Arabian, Quran was read, mosque, madrasa. As before, it was just beginning of 20th century with Russian revolutions when Soviet, they came to power, starting since 1970. 18, so it was already Sovietic, so communism. That is the concept was just you should delete and kill all national identity. And national identity, it is religions, as well as for any other countries of religion, for Azerbaijan same. So that's why the religion and Islam was forbidden. People couldn't pray. All mosques, they were all demolished. Just 17 mosques was in Azerbaijan working still. Later they were restored after independence. The same thing for another. Yes, I will, yeah. Yeah. Like this?
Closer?
Yeah, good. Yeah, okay. Okay, and so that is why the people could talk of Islam or talking using Arabian language or read Quran or pray actually. So it was just multicultural, Soviet Republic. It was just Russian language, everything. It was standard the same in Uzbekistan, in Azerbaijan, in our area. But people, they used to save the culture and the generation who was still living in this period, they had their prayer all time. So not my father, for example, because he was born in 50s, but people who was born before, for example, they, my grandmother, grandfather, they used to they prayer, and everyone did their Ramadan. So my grandmother, she did her Ramadan all time, and when I was child, I did with her. So since it's just, I'm not praying, for example, but I'm doing my Ramadan because this is our traditional and cultural legacy. So this is how we can talk of Islam not only just through religions, more through as cultural product, which was spreaded through art and culture, poetry, poems, and the artists who started to do miniatures. This is the Islamic visual art miniatures. We haven't painting in Islam works, and calligraphy work, for example. So it was spreaded not only, as you told, Zachary, he told, through, people should accept Islam all like this. It was just spreaded himself as a culture products, as a copies of Firdausi Shahnameh, or I don't know, as a copy of, just dress, fashion, food, and poems of great poet Nizami, Nasimi, Hafiz, Fizuli, and all in this big region from Samarkand, China, till Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. So,
Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
If we move to Uzbekistan, to Abdelhalim of back room, when we think about Uzbekistan, we're struck by the incredible number of names that come up from history. I can mention Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni, of course, Imam al-Bukhari. We're talking about other names, Ulugh Beg, and my question to you is, what is special about Uzbekistan that produced these incredible scholars? And also, if you could say a few words, they wrote in Arabic, but what was their language? Did they communicate to each other in Arabic? And you also mentioned when we were talking earlier that although we mentioned 4 or 5 famous ones, you're telling me there are lists of about 3,000 other scholars that we do not know about. So what is in the water of Uzbekistan that managed to produce such incredible contribution to Islam?
قبل كل شيء أنا أريد أن أعبر شكري جزيل شخصيا وكذلك شكر الوفد الأوزبكي الذي يشترك الآن في هذا البينال الإسلام فنون الإسلامية، ونحن مسرورين جدا أن نكون هنا معكم، وإحنا آخذين معنا انطباعات جميلة جدا إلى وطننا، وإن شاء الله في المستقبل تعاون يكون أكثر. Now, in terms of my presentation for today, I am planning to talk about the medieval scholars, about their heritage, and majority of them either was born there or participated or lived in Central Asia. As it was mentioned, number of them, more than 2,000, recently we published a book about the name and heritage of those scholars, but taking into the consideration a limited time, I would like to give very brief information about maybe 10 scholars, some of them very famous, some of them until now unknown. And in order to finish it on time, I would like to read, it will be easier for me and it will be on time. Uzbekistan is a land of great historic heritage and ancient culture. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, and Tashkent have histories that stretch back for millennia. At various times, they have been part of the powerful states, important trade centers on international roads, and places where trade, architecture, science, and the art were highly developed. The region in Mawar al-Nakhar, presently known as Central Asia, became part of the expanding Muslim empire during the year 715. The conversion of Central Asia to Islam was a significant event in the history of the region. The rise and spread of Islam was paralleled by the unprecedented uprise of the literary and educational activities. For this reason, Central Asia has had a long Islamic past in which a rich, diverse literature has been composed by the local scholars. Samarkand is located in the region that has been important since the ancient times, when different peoples came into the close contact with the Chinese civilization. The city functioned as an important commercial and cultural center and was situated along the famous Silk Road. From 760 AD, Samarkand became a center for paper production, which is supplied to the whole Islamic world for almost 200 years. The introduction of paper industry gave an impetus to the spread of the knowledge since the Abbasid age, so a complete change to paper from the papyrus and parchment. The second Central Asia city of Bukhara was also a well-known center of the learning. Similarly, Khiva and Marv became centers of the learning. The complex of all these factors was conducive to the appearance of the galaxy of the famous Central Asian scholars. And a few words I would like to say about the Baghdad, because it was a very close activity between the Central Asian above mentioned cities and Baghdad. That is why majority of those scholars were very connected with the activity in Baghdad. Baghdad at the time was the scene of the intensive intellectual activity. With the active encouragement of the caliphs, a number of the eminent scientists worked in the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, the first and most famous Islamic center for translation and science. The most famous scholars who worked at the Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad and who was connected closely with Central Asia were Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarazmi, Ahmad al-Farghani, Abu Nasr al-Farabi, Al-Abbas al-Jawhari, Ahmad al-Marwazi, Ahmad al-Saghani, Ahmad al-Sarakhsi, Abu al-Fadl ibn Turk al-Khuttali, and Khalid al-Marwarudi. The majority of these scholars were members of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. I am not going to talk about the Baghdad because, in the House of Wisdom, it will take more time. And the most famous scholar from the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, who originally came from Khwarazm, was, of course, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarazmi. He made a huge impact on mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Muhammad al-Khwarazmi is founder of the several concepts of the modern mathematics. In particular, he was the first founder of the contemporary science of algebra. In fact, the word algebra was taken from the first word of the scholar's famous treatise entitled The Compendious Book by Completion and Balancing, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fil Jabr wal-Muqabala. It was changed and pronounced as algebra in European languages and remains an important branch of the modern mathematics. He also officially introduced the concept of zero to arithmetic, which resulted in the 10-digit system now used worldwide. Also, one of the scholars' works on the system of the calculation became famous in Europe under the title of algorithms, which came from his name and afterwards became an independent discipline. Al-Khwarazmi also made a significant contribution to geography. His work, The Picture of Earth, Kitab Surat al-Ard, was an early and important geographical source in Arab Caliphate. And some sources have described more than 7 scholars carried out the investigations under the Al-Khwarazmi's supervision and created the world's first map. And another Central Asian astronomer and mathematician who worked in Baghdad was Ahmad ibn Abdullah al-Marwazi, known by the name of the Black Accountant, al-Habash al-Khasib. Originally, this scholar was from Merv and he carried out his scientific investigation in the Bayt al-Hikmah in the court of Khalifa al-Mamun. Ahmad al-Marwazi was the author of the many treatises devoted to the astronomical instruments and geometry, such as Astronomical Tablet Zij, which was compiled in 3 volumes, Zij, Damascus Zij, and Shahed Zij of Al-Mamun. Al-Marwazi's contribution to the trigonometry was his most well-known accomplishment. The first table of tangent and cotangents and table of cosinus to the first degree were given in the unique copy of his book Damascus Zij, which today preserved in the Berlin Library. The next scholar who had a major role in the development of mathematical science in the 9th century was AbdelRahman ibn Turk al-Khuttali. He belonged to the Khuttalan area between the Panj and Pakistan rivers in the modern Republic of Tajikistan. He was, as Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarazmi, a very famous mathematician of that time. The role of Central Asian scholars in the astronomy of that period was also significant. In particular, Yahya ibn Mansur, a scholar from Marv, in the modern Republic of Turkmenistan, established the first astronomical observatory in the Shamasiya district of Baghdad. His colleague Khalid ibn Abdul Malik al-Marwarudi built the second observatory on the Qassiyun Hill area near Damascus. Ahmad al-Farghani was among the famous scholars of Baghdad Astronomical School. His works had a significant impact on the development of the astronomy, geography, and mathematical science, and he was an expert in the making of astronomical tools and instruments. Additionally, he was a capable engineer of the Hedra project, as shown by his supervision of the construction of the Nilometer in Rauda Island on the river Nile. Okay. Just as I said, I would like to conclude, and the number of scholars who worked in Central Asia, who originally came from Central Asia and worked in the different parts of the Arabic and Islamic world, they contributed greatly to the development of the exact science, not only exact science, even humanity science and Islamic science. The name of some of them very famous in the Islamic world, like Imam al-Bukhari, Imam al-Tirmidhi, and Mahmud al-Zakhmakhshari, who was very important figure in the Arabic language, and Burhanuddin Marghanani and others. And a reason and why number of the scholars worked there in Central Asia was it was the several schools and traditions, scientific in the Central Asian regions, starting from the time of the Baghdad, then in the Khwarazm during the time of the Khwarazm Shah al-Mamun, and afterwards during the time of the Amir Timur. It was number of the scholars working in the field of in the observatory in Samarkand, and we brought maquette of this observatory here and in Biennale. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to a country that has a Muslim minority, the UK, a country that I know very well. I grew up. When I was growing up as a Muslim in the late 70s and early 80s, I must say Islam was very little known. I remember going to school when it was Ramadan and nobody had heard of Ramadan. There was very little awareness of what it was like to be a Muslim, a British Muslim. And that has changed dramatically in the 1980s and the 1990s. Today, one can speak of a British Muslim identity, of a reasonably thriving Muslim culture. I'd like to ask our speaker, Shahed Saleem, who has written a book on the mosques in Britain. You mentioned that the first mosques were built in the 1880s, but of course Islam had been in England long before then. If you could just say a few words about your work, but also to ponder on the question of this emerging British Muslim identity. In a country where I think Muslims are 3 or 4% of the population, is there really viable to talk about a British Muslim identity when overwhelmingly the Muslim presence is often viewed within an anti-terrorism prism, which is of course the prevent strategy that everybody who's grown up in England is familiar with?
Thank you. Yeah, it's good that you set the scene of the way in which Islam and Muslim identity has become more prominent and established in Britain. And in my work, I've looked at the history of the mosque in Britain. So I looked at the way in which the mosque was first established as an architectural object and how it then grew in numbers and evolved as an architectural language. So now there are approximately 2,000 mosques across Britain. And that's from, similar, right? Okay, yeah, similar number, yeah. And that's from 1889 was the first built mosque. So the first structure that was built as a functioning mosque was in 1889. There was also a house that was converted into a mosque in Liverpool in the same year. And there's two phases really to the evolution of the mosque in Britain. One is from that period up until World War II, and then the second period is after the Second World War, so post-war, and that is the period of decolonization. So the time in which India became independent, the formation of Pakistan and Bangladesh, So there's a post-war history, which is the one which I think I'll talk about more, because I think it's that post-war history which is the period in which Islam and Muslim culture really became established and became sort of embedded within the country. And that's because immediately after the war, but after the partition of India and the independence of India, people were coming from the Commonwealth, so from the West Indies and from South Asia, to work in industries in Britain. So Britain needed a huge amount of labour post-war. And that labour was brought from the Commonwealth and largely, as I'm saying, West Indies and the Caribbean and South Asia. From South Asia, it was largely migrants coming from northern parts of Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from certain parts of India, usually northern Gujarat and other sort of northern parts of India. And people came directly from those countries into Britain from the 60s, 1960s onwards, and they also came via East African countries later on in the 70s. There's a large East African migration into Britain as well. So in that way, the kind of early migrants, early Muslim migrants, were coming largely, predominantly from South Asian backgrounds. And it was that community that really established the they laid the groundwork for the Muslim culture that exists to this day, and that is emerging and evolving into what we might call a British Muslim identity, whether that is actually happening. And what I've become particularly interested in is the way in which this culture, this kind of Muslim religious and social and cultural practice emerged. So it didn't come from any kind of formal or organized method. There wasn't a political or a theological or a kind of social or a cultural program, as there may have been in the spread of Islam into other countries, as we've been hearing. So there wasn't this kind of formal route by which Islam, as a religious ideology or as a cultural ideology, came to Britain. It was really carried by the migrants who were coming into the country. And the kind of knowledge that the migrants brought with them was really embedded within them from their lifestyles. So it wasn't necessarily a kind of schooled knowledge. It wasn't that the people had gone to Islamic school or they weren't trained in madrasas and so on. It was really their kind of lived experience of Islam in their home countries that they brought to Britain. They didn't try and re-establish that straight away. Many stories that I hear is that when initially it was men that came on their own to work, and the men lived amongst themselves, they would share houses, and we're talking about the 1960s into the 70s, let's say. And many stories that when I've interviewed people is that they would say, well, actually, we weren't religious at all. Actually, we didn't really kind of pray. There was no for Friday prayers. Sometimes we didn't even know when Eid was. There's no kind of like major awareness of kind of Islamic life or culture, because they had just come as working people. It was usually after their wives came. So some of them would be married back in their home countries, and their wives would still be there, and then they would bring them. Or they would maybe be married while they were in England. But it was usually after the coming of the wives and then the starting of families that the necessity was felt to start to establish Islamic learning and kind of cultural life, if you like. And that was really from the late 60s onwards. And that's what I find interesting is, how did that actually happen? It wasn't, again, like I was saying, a formal process, but it was the kind of embedded knowledge that people brought with them. So, for example, when we were kids, the way in which our kind of Islamic schooling, as it were, happened through a number of parents would come together, and they would bring the children together on a Friday evening or Sunday or so on, and they would organize classes amongst themselves on the weekends, and then they would take it in turns to teach the children their Islamic knowledge. Sometimes they would bring somebody who was maybe from a sort of their countries back home, who would have some more Islamic teaching or Islamic knowledge, or who was perceived to have more Islamic knowledge, and that person would become the teacher. Pretty much it was always a man, would be become the teacher of that community. So, for example, in the community that my parents were from, which was an Indian, Hyderabadi Indian community, within their community of migrant people, there was one man who was more knowledgeable than the others because he had learned more and he had read more books and so on, and he was considered to be a more religious person. And he became the teacher of that community. Every month they used to have a tafsir circle where they would get teaching from this particular person. Again, it's a kind of, and this was happening all over the country in similar ways, to different varying scales. And this sort of is a way in which Islamic knowledge and cultural practice has come into Britain. And then what's interesting is that people are then coming from many different Islamic backgrounds, many different denominations, many different theological positions, different schools of thought. There's nothing organizing which one has a priority over the other, except maybe, let's say, demographics. But even then, they all kind of exist in the same space. So what you end up with now is probably one of the most diverse Muslim communities in the world, let's say, or some of the most diverse in the world, in terms of that you get every type of Muslim denomination and practice that goes on, and there's no official way in which you can make a differentiation between one type of practice and another. All of them have a kind of equal footing, if you like. So what I'm particularly interested in is the way in which this kind of self-taught, self-made, and ad hoc Islam has emerged in Britain. And I think that's the case in these diasporas which are in former colonial nations, so Northern Europe, US, and Australia, let's say kind of Western nations in which diasporas have established themselves. I think there's a similarity in that. So you have this kind of, and it's a type of culture which has been self-made, but it's also composed of different elements of Islamic culture and knowledge and so on, which have been brought together to create this kind of composite. So I think if we're talking about the possibility of a British Islam, then I think it would be characterized by this nature of the culture, and that meaning kind of religious knowledge and religious practice, and sort of theological understanding even though of course there's a kind of commonality, there is a kind of core common beliefs and values and traditions and so on. I think there are many nuances within that people practice which have emerged in those particular nations. I think you see it now perhaps on social media, so where you have the different Muslim groups which have kind of Instagram, Twitter feed, so on and so on, where you then get people putting in, and it can be quite light-hearted, people putting in comments, or they could be joking about something, or this happened or that happened, and then they make it, and they're sort of about their kind of Muslim dilemmas, let's say. And they become sort of manifest on social media, and they become a kind of almost like one could say a sort of fiqh, which starts to emerge through this commonality of sharing of Muslim experience in the kind of Western world. And one could look at that as a sort of emergence of a new type of religious understanding and practice. So so those are the kind of things that
I would also add that one of the most positive things that have emerged from the British Muslims is the stand-up comedy that's actually coming up through at the moment. There's some amazing British Muslim humor, and it shows a burgeoning self-confidence in actually speaking out and no longer being on the defensive. And it's going to be interesting to see in the next generation how this ad hoc Islam emerges into a confident, vibrant British Muslim identity. Thank you. So, having been to West Africa, having been to Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and England, we now return back to Saudi Arabia with Rakan. And as one of the architects of the Islamic Biennale, we've spoken about this many times, and it's clear that for you, the relationship and one of the main aims of the Biennale is to establish this connection between the center, the edge, the intellectual journey of culture, of art, of understanding, of cooperation. And inshallah, this is something that the Biennale is going to build on. I just want to ask your opinion, having worked on the Al-Madar Gallery and having taken the first steps towards that and having listened to the speakers tonight, whether you feel this is the first positive step that's been taken and how you see the Biennale now progressing.
Well, thank you. Certainly, I think Al-Madar, and for all of you who haven't seen it yet, Al-Madar uniquely from the curated show, from Awal Bayt, was this platform which the foundation has worked on to bring in institutions, keepers and safeguarders of Islamic heritage from around the world. Now, this year we were blessed with 12 cooperating institutions, but inshallah this is something that's anticipated to grow. And I think when we talk about center or an edge and so on, we just have to be careful a little bit, because we can simplify and think about this through purely a geographic dimension, which is probably this linear, simple way to look at it. But especially as we just discussed now, from Khwarizmi to British Muslims and diasporic communities today, there's a temporal and time dimension to center and edge that we can kind of have to think about. And I think one of the prompts in the description of today's talk was about how does the center be enriched by the edge or the periphery. And it's very important to think about this, that this is not, there is no way that this becomes one way. This civilization, that culture, religion, sort of societal, social constructions of Islam have proved over 14 centuries to be extremely pliable and adaptable across geographies, across time, across community structures as well. And I think it's fascinating to talk about minority Muslim populations today around the world in the same fold of edge and periphery and center. So when we think about this and the pliability, this is something that is unique, and I think something that in a way is quite honoring about this, thinking about the civilization. But it's also, we all understand that there is this core threads that continue across time, across geography. They are theological, they are sort of social structures, and they are certainly geographic with the location, with locations here in the holy sites of Islam in Mecca and Medina. But to think that if we think about this exchange between center and periphery, is something that breathes and continues to exchange across time is a very important way to think about it. And I think the attempt here at the Biennale, by collapsing the time element and bringing sort of contemporary works, by collapsing the geographic dimension in Al-Madar onto itself, the idea is to bring into close encounter that exchange, to make it a little bit easier, to make it more fresh, because, to bring Tashkent into the thought of a new creative artist today from Morocco is also a desirable outcome out of this. I always used to say, and forgive me if this is anecdotal, but if you think about enriching the center culturally, the staple Saudi breakfast is Egyptian beans and Afghani bread. It's full of timis. It's uniquely eaten in Saudi Arabia. So the center is absorbing and breathing this exchange as much as the periphery. There is no sort of central expansion, neither across time nor geography. And I think Al-Madar, this Biennale and Al-Madar specifically, hopefully can, again, just collapse that distance, can ease this idea of owning the sort of the framing and the future discussions and conversations that will think about what is the future of this exchange. And it's important for us also to think about edge and periphery today in a very diverse and inclusive way of people who perhaps, because Islam is now a 1.5 billion Muslims and diasporic communities in probably 200 countries, the effect of this civilization, of this culture, again, and of this religion, I don't want to use one descriptor, is felt and affects non-Muslims. And non-Muslims are, have familial, social relationships with Muslims. There's a higher degree of inclusiveness and integration. And much as this civilization has proved to be pliable, adaptable across geography and time, today perhaps across, populations, we should understand that. And we can welcome and work with non-Muslim or non-Islamic art-focused institutions in Al-Madar, because there's so much around the objects or the historic items or the manuscripts that contain some of the historic scientific discoveries of Islam that has inspired, Accademia dell'Ince in Italy. And what happened to the Accademia dell'Ince and during the Renaissance with the Islamic scholars? That's a world that you can bring into Al-Madar. There is no need to ring fence and close this. And that's a lot of the sort of future vision to, of course, expand the platform, become this convener, without sort of the hegemonic idea, but the convener idea of Islamic institutions, of safeguarders, keepers of Islamic heritage, people who want to shape new ideas and new narrative around Islamic creativity, culture, and humanities, and so on. But to keep it open and flexible so that it continues to be enriched. Now, if the center is Mecca, in a ritual and religious sense, and the ambition for this Biennale is to think about the center of cultural shaping of the cultural future of Islam through a platform like the Biennale, through a platform like Al-Madar. And it's very important, and we spoke about this as well with Dr. AbdelRahman and I, to think about what happens in the intervening 2 years. The idea here is the real legacy of this event and these exhibitions and these discussions and panels and so on is to immediately start to find synapses that fire to have collaboration. The collaboration does not have to be between the center and the periphery. Again, the collaboration can be between institutions from Central Asia and Africa, or from Southeast Asia and Europe. But I think collectively what is happening is a convening moment that hopefully shapes terminology and discourse together, collectively. And that's a lofty ambition, but I think it's one with cooperation and buy-in from people around the world, as we've sensed really in this last week, is something that we should aim for.
And I think one way of the collapse, the positive collapse you're talking about and collaboration, is of course the technology and the digitization and the introduction of things like machine learning and AI into the discourse. And there will come a time when manuscripts from West Africa and manuscripts from Uzbekistan have been digitized, and through machine learning we can create algorithms that will search. And I promise you, from my experience, machine learning will actually transform scholarship. It will not just enrich it, it will actually transform it, because machines can see things that humans cannot see. And I hope that, inshallah, the Biennale will also be a platform, a digital platform as well as a physical platform, which will help scholars and the public interact and also understand the legacy in a much richer way. I'm just looking at Saif and seeing if we have a bit of time for questions, or are we okay for a few minutes, or? A few questions. I know I'm running out of time. So maybe gentleman there.
Unbelievable. It seems like it's the 25th Biennale and not the first, so congratulations to everybody. And I just wanted to ask everybody here, like, what is happening now? Why is this, this Islamic Biennale and all of the culture expansion that we're seeing around the world, what is so special about now? Why now? What was the spark? And what is happening, because Islamic culture has always been extraordinarily rich in its culture. But why? What's the spark now? And then another question in general for the group is, how do you think that culture, and in particular art, can actually be a driver for a change in society that I think we're starting to see now?
So Pablo sent me a tough one. So I mean, why now the Islamic Biennial, or why now in Islamic culture in general? Why now the Islamic Biennial is quite, it's an easy to address question. I'll attempt to. Why in Islamic culture? I think I would love to hear other people's thoughts, and I'll share my own. So I think the biennial itself did not come out of a vacuum. There is a serious effort on the part of the government of Saudi Arabia to think about cultural development. It started, with the Vision 2030 program, certainly with the establishment of the Ministry of Culture in 2018, sort of a real drive to think about targeted and structured cultural development across a very large value chain of disciplines, of thinking about both the creative economy and sort of the economic impact of creative industry, across thinking about national identity and a reinforcement of social desired sort of social attachment to the history of this country, a reclaiming of the history of pre-Islamic Arabia, which is recent in Saudi Arabia, into as well as sort of the Islamic history of Saudi Arabia, and frankly, a re-engagement with the world in cultural conversations and cultural dialogue that is quite important in a world that has become maybe less tolerant over the last 20 years, maybe more polarized, especially around social and cultural topics. And certainly for Muslims and for the Islamic world, a one where it's quite easy to be misunderstood and have been misunderstood. So it's a big idea around the cultural development. The biennial itself, both this one and the Diriyah Contemporary Biennial, is part of a plan to understand the arts ecosystem as a whole, to have platforms that complete the value chain of thinking of talent development programs, of scholarships, of incentives for creative businesses, of building an art economy, of gallery support, all the way to a non-commercial, more sort of intellectual platform and convener, such a biennial. So then the question is, why Islamic biennial? And I think that's probably why we're all here. And why Islamic biennial? I think, or I believe that for the Ministry of Culture and for the Diriyah Biennale Foundation, the Diriyah Contemporary Biennial and the Islamic Art Biennial they don't clash. There's a high degree of reinforcement. The idea of reinforcing each other, the idea of being part of sort of the global arts conversation in the Diriyah Biennale is very important. But what happens in the Islamic Arts Biennial is equally, if not greater in importance, in that, one, it reinforces an attachment to an inherited legacy that is key to how we all believe, what is our self-perception of our country, of us as Saudi Arabians. Two, it is the duty of this country, stated in the name of the king of this country, to be custodians of the two holy mosques. The sense of this country's duty towards serving pilgrimage, towards safeguarding the holy sites of Islam I think it's quite clear and self-evident. The choice of this location was intentional to, again, with the concept of inclusiveness, to bring non-Muslims even as close to the experience of a pilgrim as possible under these canopies. And as I kind of alluded to and talked about in Dr. AbdelRahman's question, Saudi Arabia is, and the kingdom is the convener of Muslims every year during Hajj season. It's the convener, at least as the curators named it through invisible lines of Qibla, of Muslims 5 times a day, everywhere around the world. It's only natural to think along the cultural development program in Saudi Arabia, to think of Saudi and the Saudi cultural ecosystem to become a convener of the Islamic culture and Islamic arts and culture. And it is, in my eye, I'm biased because I'm involved with Diriyah Biennale Foundation, but in my mind it requires as much of an intent and a commitment as the commitment that is there to serve the pilgrims, to be the convener of Islamic arts and culture. So the attempt here, this first attempt, is to do that. So I guess that's why now.
Sultan.
I have a question, if I may follow have of and Eva and so on, you see. So what I want to know is that, is there a process now taking place of extracting yourself out of this influence, this cultural, imposing technique?
Okay, thank you very much. And we know in the period, Soviet time was not easy time, and it was complicated, and a lot of things has changed, and the culture which was not convenient for those regions, they became established. But in spite of those problems, and the people in Central Asia and other part of the former Soviet Union, they tried to keep their traditions, mostly Islamic traditions, and now and after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when all of the countries in Central Asia and other parts of the former Soviet Union they became independent states, and the situation is totally different. And for example, Islamic traditions and the belief to the Islam is becoming more and more people. It was in spite of the very difficult time, people tried to keep these Islamic traditions. Now, and the door is open, and Uzbekistan and all other countries of Central Asia, they are communicating and working, cooperating with Islamic. And now, if you look at those countries, you will find a completely different picture. So, time is changing. Thank you.
I think probably that's, there's one final question.
Sorry. If you could comment about the idea of the rihla in Islam, the rihla of knowledge, and of course the ultimate rihla is the rihla to the center, which is the rihla to the Kaaba, but the movement of knowledge around the world, for example, from Andalusia to Egypt, etc., and backwards, and just that, and how that can be reflected in the modern world today, the rihla of knowledge.
Maybe Zachary.
Rihla to the center.
You can talk about that and mention, so of course, Mansa Musa.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And if you look at these traditional rihla texts, sorry, you should have told me that earlier. These traditional rihla texts, they do talk about what the pilgrim thought when he was going to the Kaaba or at Medina, the scholars that they met. But they're very often much larger texts that talk about all of the different cultural varieties of cultural interchanges that people had. So, of course, the famous story of Mansa Musa, allegedly the world's richest man in world history, that came from Mali to make pilgrimage and brought lots of scholars back into West Africa. There's also the famous Rihla of Ibn Battuta. And interesting enough, when he goes down into Mali, one of the examples he gives is of meeting with a scholar, and he says, I'm seeing this woman, while we're talking, this woman is now freely talking with another man sitting on a couch. What's going on? He said, oh yeah, that's my wife. He said, how is it that you're allowing your wife to talk to another man? And he says, well, they're exchanging knowledge. We don't see any problem with that. So, you find these very interesting details reflected in these accounts that I think can be enriching when we think about the kind of processes that were spoken about. In terms of new orientations about embracing the world, we can draw upon the breadth of our traditions in our cultures while still being Islamic. And I think this is the traditional understanding of an Islamic civilization, is something that it does involve ideas from non-Muslims. It borrows very freely from them without sacrificing one's sort of constitutive central identity. And I think that's a kind of a process of healing coming out of colonialism, where we can sort of reclaim our cultural diversity and think about what we share in common to face the future. So the rihla is very important for that. Yeah.
I could just add that it's interesting to note that more kings of Mali made the pilgrimage than any of the Ottoman or Mamluk sultans, which gives you a sense of how pious they were and the arduous journey they had to make. I think that's all that's left for me now is to thank our panel for a wonderful conversation and to perhaps to make two reminders to you. The first is if you haven't seen, please go to Al-Madar Gallery, observe it. And the final thing, just to echo Rakan, go and have some fool. It really is worth it. Thank you so much.